Good evening. Welcome to Uncensored here on 6 News. I'm Leonardo Puglisi. The US midterm elections are right around the corner, and as predicted, there's a lot of focus on Democrats and Republicans. But what about minor parties or third parties in the United States, like the Libertarian Party, the Forward Party, the Green Party? Do they have any success, and why can't they seem to have much success? To answer that question and for more on his party, I spoke to Spike Kellman, who is the Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate at the 2020 US election. I spoke to him with 6 News podcast host and law and government editor Stuart Jeffrey to answer that question and for more on those upcoming midterms. Spike Cohen, welcome to 6 News. How are you?
I'm doing great, Leonardo. Thanks for having me on, man.
Great to have you here. So first of all, we know here in Australia we've had some really recent, and it's been ongoing, some success with our minor parties and our independent candidates. The recent federal election saw a large number of them elected, and our votes to the major parties seem to be going down. But in the US, it seems like it's impossible for a non-Democrat or Republican to win, with the exception of two independent senators who caucus with the Democrats anyway.
Right.
Why do you think that is primarily, that third parties have so little success in the United States?
Well, I think it boils down to two things. You could add a third thing in there, but for the sake of this, we'll boil it down to two things. One is the fact that, unlike in Australia, we have first past the post voting. So whoever gets the most votes wins the race. And so that leads to this dynamic where people are scared that if they vote for a so-called minor party or third party, like, for example, the Libertarian Party, if they vote for that candidate, then they're going to take votes away from their lesser evil candidate. You know, if they look at the two main choices, they will say, well, if I vote for my preferred pick and it leads to enough votes being taken from the one that I would prefer to win over the one I'd prefer not to win, that's one big thing. And then the other thing is that we also have some major ballot access restrictions, which we can get into the details of that. But where the Republicans and Democrats, one of the things they agree on is that they should make it nearly impossible for anyone else to even get on the ballot in the first place.
Do you think anything can be achieved in terms of minor party or third party success without having some kind of reform in how people vote, in terms of, dumping first past the post and maybe getting into, as I think some areas in the US have done or trialed, a ranked choice voting, or as we would call it, preferential voting system?
Yeah, I think even without having those put in place, I think the biggest thing that we need is, and I mentioned this before, we need some ballot access reform. So, for example, in one of our states, in Tennessee, if you want to run for office in Tennessee as a Republican or a Democrat, you need to get 50 signatures on a ballot access petition. And that makes sense. They want to make sure that, not every single person wants to run for office. They don't want a ballot that's 50 pages long with every person that said that they're running for whatever office. So they say if you can get 50 signatures, that shows you're serious. If you want to run as anything other than a Republican or a Democrat, you have to get 50,000 signatures. They increased it by 1,000 times the number of signatures you need to get. And the people that look at and verify those signatures are Republicans and Democrats. They've been appointed by Republicans and Democrats. So really, you need to get 100,000 signatures just to even get on the ballot in the first place. And that's even if you're running in a race where there aren't even 100,000 voters in your district or your city or wherever you're running. So that's probably the biggest single thing that we need from a legislative standpoint, is for the ability to even get on the ballot to be at least brought to the same level as what Republicans and Democrats have.
50,000, I mean, that's just an extraordinary figure when you consider, as you mentioned, it was 50 for Republicans and Democrats. And I know in Australia, at least in terms of us getting a minor party registered with our federal electoral commission, I think it's something like 1,500 verified members.
Right.
In a state like mine, Victoria, it's 500. When you consider 25 million in Australia, that seems a bit more reasonable. But it seems like a lot of work, 50,000 at least signatures in a race that odds are extremely stacked against you when you're not a Republican or Democrat.
It's functionally impossible. So again, this would include someone who's running for, say, a city council race in a city that doesn't even have 100,000 people, which mean or 50,000 people, much less the 100,000. You truly need to make sure that the election judges that are looking at all the signatures don't kick you off the ballot anyway. So it's not functionally possible. So what happens is they either don't run, they run as independent, which means no one even knows what they're about, or they have to run as a Republican or a Democrat. So that's just one of many examples. My state, South Carolina, is a little bit better when it comes to ballot access, but there are some states that are even worse. New York's even worse than Tennessee. So no, it is a major, major hurdle that we have.
So aside from those vote requirements, are there any other things involved, like financially? Do you have to raise a certain amount of money to get on the ballot, or is it just vote signatures?
It varies from state to state. I do think that there are some that have some kind of a requirement for money raised, but usually it's either the number of signatures that you can get on a petition, or the percentage of the vote that your party got in some given race. Sometimes it's how well they did on the presidential race in the last election, or how well any of your statewide candidates did. In some states, like in Indiana, it's specifically the Secretary of State election at the state level that they use, what percentage you get, and it's from state to state in all 50 states, it's wildly different. But the as a whole, it is usually anywhere from 10 to 1,000 times harder for someone who is not running as a Republican or Democrat to even get on the ballot. It's absurd. And in fact, when the Republicans and Democrats will face challenges and defend challenges to these laws in court, they will straight up say, we're doing this because we think it helps the voters to be narrowed down to two choices and not have so many other choices to be confused by.
So, of course, to change those laws in the first place, you have to actually get elected, because
That's the
the
problem.
two major parties aren't going to try and change it themselves. So, how do you get people elected in the first place?
And that's
Given
the
all the ballot
challenge, right?
access.
That's exactly the challenge, Stuart, is that we are having to tell the very people who benefit from these types of laws that they need to make these changes. We also have to market to the voters that these changes need to happen, but inherently when we do so, we're helping drive home the message that a vote for us is a vote for someone who's likely not to win in the first place. So it's a really challenging situation to be in, which is why I have focused more and more on the nonprofit I started, which is called You Are the Power, which is actually focusing on growing the liberty movement outside of any political party so that the people themselves demand freedom, whether it's from Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, Independents, or some other party. I'm finding that my focus is less and less on trying to work within a rigged game and more on creating a culture that will demand these kinds of changes no matter who gets elected.
Yeah, so of course you mentioned Libertarian Party, which I think is the third biggest party in the US.
Yep.
Obviously, yourself running as a vice presidential candidate in 2020. So, can you just run us through roughly how the Libertarian Party tries to get on these ballots? How do they go? Is it door to door knocking? How do you actually go about getting these signatures to go on the ballot in the first place? At
So
least in the Libertarian Party.
So for the states where they're the most challenging, like in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Tennessee or New York, the short answer is that that is the biggest challenge that the Libertarian Party has, both at the national level and at the state level and at the local level for that matter too. And so, for example, in Pennsylvania, after we had already been nominated for president and vice president, we went to Pennsylvania to help with the ballot access signature collections and to help drive attention and to get people out to help to sign the petitions and to collect signatures. So it's an all hands on every 4 years. It is an all hands on deck measure effort across the country, or at least in the states that have the most restrictive laws, to be able to get us on the ballot. In addition to that, at the federal level, Republican and Democrat federal candidates get matching funds courtesy of the United States taxpayer. Now, while we are having to fight to even get on the ballot, the two main parties, the duopoly, they get taxpayer money to help bankroll their campaigns. And it is intentionally set up to make sure that only Republicans and Democrats are able to win, which is again why my biggest fight now is to try to grow a culture of liberty, because the reality is until we get people in there who recognize that the status quo is failing us and want to change it, we're asking the people who benefit from the status quo to change the status quo and allow for more competition. And in the 50 years we've been doing it, that hasn't happened yet.
So, of course, you mentioned how you were going out and onto the into the various states to doing tours and stuff like that in 2020 at least. But how do you do that in the midterms when you don't have a presidential election? So you don't have two candidates who actually get more press. So how do you go about doing that into the midterms where you don't have the ability to rely on presidential candidate and a vice presidential candidate? How do you exactly go about getting those votes then for the midterms?
That honestly falls a lot on the individual candidates themselves and on the state parties. The national party helps with messaging and some help with donation of resources, data sharing, and things like that. But it really falls on the candidates to be able to do the candidates and the campaigns they build to do as well as they can. Now, one thing to know: there are hundreds of elected libertarians, but they're all at the local level. These are people in city councils, mayors, county councils, and things like that. The Libertarian Party has never won a single statewide or federal election, and it's largely because of first past the post voting, the whole dynamic of lesser evil voting, and the ballot access challenges that are in place. But it really does fall on the candidates, and we've had some incredible candidates who have gotten in second place or gotten double digits. Have many of them, dozens of them, who have ended up in the debates and have created major shockwaves and caused changes to the outcome of who won the election and everything else. We haven't quite risen to the level of winning one of those elections yet, but we're closer than we've ever been. We do a little bit better every election cycle than the one before.
Now, of course, you ran for, probably as a Libertarian candidate, the second highest as the vice president nomination.
Yep.
You surely would have had to recognise that, again, it was near impossible. So why run? Is it just like a trial run to see how many votes you might get, how much support there is nationally? Because my understanding was, even with those challenges, you were the only minor party on the ballot in every single state.
We were the
So, yeah, why run?
Yeah, so we were the only party in this last election cycle. We were the only party who, as I put it, earned our way onto all 50 state ballots. Republicans and Democrats are on there automatically. No one else was able to get on there. So your question to why run, it's twofold. Number one, even though we aren't in a position yet to be able to win, we can use that race to get national attention to the message of the Libertarian Party and to libertarianism. But my big focus when I was running for vice president was helping what we call the down ballot races, the local races, the statewide races, the races where we have a much better chance of winning. And so when I would have events across the country, I would tell the local organizers, find all the local libertarians who are running for anything. I don't care if it's dog catcher, whatever they're running for, have them come out, have them give a little 2 or 3 minute speech. I'll give my big stump speech about our campaign, but I will make a point of pointing out those people running and saying, these are the ones who can win, and we can show how libertarianism works in your backyard. And thanks to those efforts, we do have hundreds of elected libertarians across the country. I did my small part in it, but those are the two main focuses behind why we run. Also, one other reason is there are some states which, like I said before, they require a presidential ticket on that party, and for them to get a certain percentage of the vote for that party to be on the ballot in that state. So we actually have to run even if we didn't want to, but we do the best that we can with it.
Are those local level libertarian, maybe successful members or candidates, and this also is a question I think applies to parties like the Green Party as well, which I think is the fourth largest party.
Yes.
Are they elected where on a ballot paper a political affiliation is actually shown, or not, and they just end up being libertarian candidates?
For most of them, no. We call them nonpartisan races, so they don't have an actual letter next to their name. Even if they're out there outspoken as libertarians, they don't have it actually next to their name. But we do have some, especially at the state legislative level, where they do have it next to their name, and some of the local races have it. But I would say, I don't know percentages, but the bulk of those are nonpartisan races. And I tell people, especially if you're running in a nonpartisan race, yes, talk about libertarianism, talk about the party, but anytime you are running for any office, the number one question that you need to answer has nothing to do with your party or your affiliation or even your ideology. The number one question that voters have is, why should I vote for you and not all those other people on the ballot? And so it becomes a highly personal thing, and the focus has to be on why that person should be elected. Again, especially if they can't fall back on whatever party they're running under. So no, I would say the bulk of them are nonpartisan races.
And you look at the 2020 presidential race again, and of course it wasn't just Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green. There were several other minor parties and independent candidates. You had parties like Socialism and Libertarian. You had Kanye West with his birthday party. You had
Yes.
a couple independents, Socialist Workers. There were Bread and Roses, whatever that means. There were quite a few there.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, even in an Australian race with our various different systems, a party like that would ordinarily get no attention for the simple reason they've got zero chance.
Right.
Theoretically, there's always a technical chance, but how much of I don't want to say that because you mentioned obviously there is local level success, but how much do you think that people not knowing much about third parties like the Libertarian, how much do you think that can be put on the media, that it might be their fault? Because it really just seems to be a Democrat versus Republican focused race in the United States at every race, whether that's a Senate race, a congressional race, a presidential race, and it's almost ridiculous at times to just say that.
Yeah, so it's one of those chicken versus egg questions. The mainstream media, the corporate media, certainly hasn't helped. To put it in perspective, I have gotten more media attention this year in an off-year, midterm race where I'm not running for anything. I've personally gotten more mainstream media attention this year or last year than either I or the presidential candidate did during the entire 2020 race. It was like we didn't exist at the national level. I think there were a handful of interviews that were done. But they will argue that the reason that it's happening is because we don't have a shot of winning. And, so why waste time in their eyes on even mentioning it more than, in passing? I would say that they could at least include us in the polling, especially since the way that for the presidential race, the way to get on the debate stage, to be included in the debates, is we have to get 15% or more in what they call reputable opinion polls. The problem is those opinion polls don't include our name. So even if other is getting in some cases 18 or 20% or anywhere near 15%, if our name's not included, then that doesn't count as us getting the 15% we need to get on the debate stage. So they're certainly not helping. But I would say that a lot of media argues, well, you need to get bigger and you need to have more support before it's worth our time, to include you in our reporting. There's some argument there, but I would say that they could certainly at least be mentioning us a little bit more. I think it is intentional. You've got the same corporate media that is, in lockstep with the politicians that are in office, that are, making sure they remain in office, because the corporations that own that media have cozy relationships with the politicians and the regulatory agencies they oversee. And so it's a nice little corporatist protection scheme there. But they definitely share a large part of the blame.
I'm reading about the presidential election again, and I know in Nevada, the ballot had an option which was none of these candidates, which had over 14,000 votes, which is really interesting when you consider that, again, most of that attention, as you just mentioned, is targeted towards the two major parties.
Yeah.
So, do you think there is genuinely, not just maybe Libertarian specifically, but do you think there is genuinely appetite for a congressman or congresswoman or a senator or maybe even a president to not be from the Democrats or Republicans genuinely out there across America?
Absolutely, and you don't have to take my word for it. There have been multiple opinion polls that have shown that sometimes as much as 75% or more of Americans want there to be what they call a viable third party, a choice besides Republicans and Democrats. Again, the problem is with that whole idea with first past the post voting, the idea becomes, well, yes, ideally I would like for there to be a third party candidate, but if I don't think they're viable, if I don't think they can win, then I'm going to vote for the lesser evil of the two main choices that I have to choose from. And the problem is, if they don't think you can win, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yes, they want something different from the status quo, but paradoxically, they vote within the status quo if they think that only the status quo is going to win. When you couple that with the ballot access challenges, and often the fact that another big thing is that there's just not a lot of brand awareness of what a libertarian is, or what a Green Party, what the Green Party believes, which is why it's incumbent on us to get the message out there. It is an uphill slog, but we have been gaining ground over time, and we just continue to fight for it. Like I said, more and more my focus is less on the electoral politics end of it, and more on the getting people to understand what our ideas are by identifying with solutions at the local level and then making the message of liberty based on that, instead of trying to start from the top and get people to vote for a presidential ticket or even a Senate ticket or something like that.
Mm. One thing on electoral politics, in fact, I know that, and I've been observing some of the midterm races closely, and one of them is the Fetterman versus Oz race. And in terms of the, kind of moving away from major parties for some people, people wanting a different appetite, I've noticed John Fetterman, he seems to be branding everything with just black and white. Fetterman, there's no vote blue messages. The word Democrat or Democrats, Democratic,
Yes.
none of that seems to be thrown out there. Do you think major parties might have to start moving towards, hiding their affiliations? Because I've looked at them and it's just this black and white branding. I've seen
Yeah.
nothing mentioning the Democrats once from him, at least just on social media.
Yeah, so that's a dynamic. I'm not sure if this is why Fetterman's doing that in his race, but there's a dynamic, like, for example, in South Carolina, where I am, very overwhelmingly Republican state. And so very often when a Democrat is running, especially in a statewide race, they don't mention that they're a Democrat in anything. There's no, the donkey symbol isn't there. They stay away from the color blue, which is associated with the Democrat Party. They do everything they can to, they don't lie about the fact that they're Democrats or necessarily hide it, but they don't talk about it. It's not out in the open. And vice versa, in states that are more blue, that are more Democrat, you'll see Republicans kind of shy away from the Republican label. But I think in general, the fact is Republicans and Democrats aren't popular. Congress has something like an 18% approval rating. The president has his approval rating somewhere in the high 30s or low 40s. These are not popular people. The problem is voters feel like those are the only options they have. It's incumbent upon us as libertarians, or even as anyone who isn't running as a Republican, to show that we are a viable alternative to that and what our solutions are.
So fundamentally, the Libertarian Party, do you think that is a party that is known by most people in America? It is obviously the third major party, third largest party, I should say. But in terms of the ideals of it, because I know I've always see people talking about infighting within the party. I think at one point 2 Libertarian Party official Twitter accounts were fighting amongst each other, which is really bizarre to see.
Yes.
And I can't even think of many things to compare that with Australian politics with. So do you think the Libertarian Party might need to solve problems within their own party before they actually try to get success from the general public and get their message out there when they're getting, stuck up on smaller issues amongst themselves?
Yeah, so the infighting is largely pointless. It's not helpful, and I think we often are nesting to cope with the fact that we aren't getting brand recognition. We'll argue over the smallest differences, as opposed to trying to figure out how to get our message out to the broader public. With that said, that is the problem. I would say that the majority of the public has probably either never heard the term libertarian or has no idea what it even means. And then a much smaller group of people, of those who have heard the term or have an idea of what it means, actually understand our platform, what our party is about, what our solutions are, what our legislative priorities and things like that are. A very small percentage of the population knows that stuff. There's a lack of brand recognition, and there's a lot of blame to go around, and the media certainly is a big part of that. But the reality is, for a very long time, the Libertarian Party has been talking about our philosophy, and honestly, most people don't connect with philosophy. They connect with solutions. They connect with, how am I going to be able to afford to put gas in my car? How am I going to be able to afford to put groceries to stock up on groceries? How am I going to be able to afford my mortgage or my rent? We have the answers to that, but we need to focus on presenting those solutions to the general public. And no, the infighting does not help. And I've been a major proponent of squashing the infighting, at least publicly. Have these arguments on your email lists or whatever else, but the idea of constantly arguing with fellow libertarians that you agree with 95+% of the time publicly on social media, where that becomes the main thing that people are talking about when they talk about us, it's certainly not helpful.
And I know even our own parties here seem to have infighting, but it's never done over Twitter. Well, actually, it might be by a few, but they seem to be outliers. One image I see for people who might not be aware about the Libertarian Party, and this actually extends overseas, it seems, on social media, that I don't think the Libertarian Party might have been able to shake, is that whenever people talk about American libertarianism, and I hate to say it, people talk about the age of consent debate, and people assume things about the party. I think one libertarian candidate might have said something about a whole debate on that. Is that an image that needs to be shaken off by those who might not know anything about your party? Or you worry
Yeah, and I'm
about it?
not sure why. I don't know of a single libertarian candidate who has ever said that, that age of consent is their top priority or even a priority. And in fact, we've actually had some people who have gotten booted off of social media for describing what they would do to a pedophile if they ever found one. So I'm not sure why that comes up. Honestly, I think it's the same reason why a lot of people think that we're selfish and don't care about other people, which is that libertarianism is largely defined by people who are not libertarians because they have the control of the public discussion and of the media. So I will say I don't know why that is there's nothing in our platform that talks about age of consent. That was never a priority of any candidate I know of that to make changes to age of consent or anything like that. I remember when Joe and I got the nomination, that was something that we were asked by a few media outlets about if that was a big concern of ours, and we put out a joint statement. Actually, I think we put out separate statements, both saying that no, that's absolutely that's not that pedophilia is a horrific crime, and anyone who victimizes minors in any way, but especially that way, should be held to the highest accountability and punished to the fullest extent of the law. So no, that is definitely something that should be shirked, and that and a few other stereotypes about libertarians are an unfortunate consequence of what happens when other people control the narrative about who and what you are.
Yeah, I think the only thing was I think there was an Arizona candidate who proposed some referendum on it. But yeah, as you mentioned there, it's always good as a 14-year-old to hear people condemning pedophilia. But no, Stuart, you go ahead.
Sure. So, of course, as you mentioned, with I guess, the media and getting actually out on the debate stage, of course, that would actually help defeat some of these stereotypes about libertarians. Of course, as we're seeing now, there are more and more libertarians getting included in the debates. Comes to mind Chase Oliver in Georgia for the Senate
Yes.
candidate, and then, of course, Shane Hazel running for the gubernatorial race. How do these affect down ballot races? Because, of course, one thing you guys have that we don't have in Australia is you have all your elections at one go, gubernatorial, Senate, local, and the like. So how do these debates help grassroots movements down ballot, and how do they help libertarians running for, say, council or the water board? How does it help them get elected, or does it not have any influence?
At the very least, Stuart, at the very least, it helps with brand recognition. It helps with people saying, oh, libertarian. Yeah, I remember when Chase Oliver asked Raphael Warnock over and over again why he doesn't, if he's ever going to read any of the bills he votes for. And all Raphael Warnock kept talking about was the Republican candidate who wasn't even there and refused to acknowledge these legitimate questions that every voter should have. And then so now when a libertarian is running for their local city council or county council or mayor or sheriff or whatever else, they go, oh yeah, libertarian, I know what that's about. And that's a very powerful thing because most voters, they're not necessarily following, they're not wonks, they're not following this on a day-to-day basis. They have kind of vague ad hoc understandings of political ideas, and so something like that can be very powerful. It can stick with people. It can make people possibly even look into the party and find out more about not just Chase Oliver in this case, or Shane Hazel, or James Seniak, or Jeff Moore, or any of the other people that have been involved in debates in this election cycle, but also their parties and what they're about, and maybe have a memory of that so that when someone is running in a down ballot in a local race, they go, oh yeah, libertarian, that sounds good. I'm willing to give that a shot. We've seen that happen.
Yeah, and of course, with the US elections being voluntary voting, unlike our mandatory voting, how do you think that these help motivate, I guess, voters to come and actually vote for the party? Because, of course, they could just choose to stay at home or go to work or whatever instead of voting. So how do you think these speeches help motivate people to actually come out and then cast their vote for the Libertarian Party or for whichever minor party is in question?
Well, I can tell you this firsthand. The places where during the campaign we had events, we saw a marked increase in votes, not just for our races, but actually higher rates of increases in votes for local down ballot races. So I think it does have a big case to make. And a lot of it isn't necessarily that a bunch of people show up, because I'd have some events where hundreds of people would show up. And this was during COVID when people were less, a little bit more scared to be around each other. But sometimes there were hundreds of people or even a couple thousand people. But there were some events I did that were in smaller towns that there were maybe 50, 60, or just under 100 people that would show up. But the local media would often come out because, vice presidential candidate comes to town to promote their campaign and to talk about local races. That gives the local candidates airtime to be able to mention their thing, that their race, possibly invites additional interviews in the future about their campaign. So it certainly helps. I mean, and us mentioning it on social media, I remember so many times I would post that I was going to be in whatever town and that I would be supporting the local candidates there. And we'd see in the comments people go, "Oh, I didn't know there were libertarians running locally. I just knew the president and vice presidential candidate." So it's even brand awareness within libertarians knowing that they have local people running. So it's definitely helpful.
Just wrapping up here, it goes back to what we were discussing earlier regarding obviously how you can get any third party in, and obviously we have the first past post system, which again really is not an easy thing to run with. I know the UK with a different parliamentary system, they also have it, and they have cases where you've got like the main opposition Labor saying, we'll just kind of we'll run a dead campaign here and let the Liberal Democrats, another minor party, come in. Not another minor party, which is always interesting to me. I know we have races here in Australia where our main party, Labor, decides not to run in maybe a by-election, or what you'd call a special election, and let the Green Party, Greens, come in. One interesting thing was that race in Alaska we saw earlier this year, where two GOP candidates, one Democratic candidate, the Democrat wins with that ranked choice voting system. And there was a lot of outrage over that, people saying, "Oh, it's corrupt. More people voted for a Republican." Yet, and I'm saying that following preferential voting here in Australia, I'm like, well, more people preferred the Democrat.
Exactly.
And, do you think if regular voters, maybe those who aren't aligned with partisan politics or just, getting aggressive because their favourite party didn't win, if they looked at how ranked choice works, or preferential as we'd say in Australia, do you think most would support that kind of system being implemented further than in some certain states or races?
Most do support it when they have it explained to them. Let's be clear about something. When your preferred candidate loses, you find things to blame for it. And so, yes, when the Republicans lost and the Democrat won there in a traditionally very red Republican state, they went, "Oh, it's because of this new system. The Republicans got more first votes, but then the Democrat won with the second votes." Well, that means the Democrat was more popular. The system worked. More people overall, as a whole, liked that candidate. So that candidate won. Good. Next time, run a candidate on your side that more people want to vote for. I mean, that it is what it is. But I think a lot of it is just, sour grapes. I remember the evening of election night when Donald Trump was ahead. I had people tweeting at me saying, "I can't believe you. You're the reason that Trump's going to be in office again. You stole votes from Joe Biden." And I had Republicans saying, "Oh, I'm so glad that you ran. You're why Donald Trump's going to win again."
Isn't it?
What's that?
Spoiler candidate.
Yes, we were the spoiler. But the thing was, when the Republicans thought we were helping them, they were happy. When the Democrats thought we were helping them, they were sad. And then the following morning, when as they started counting the absentee ballots and the mail-in votes, and now Biden was ahead, suddenly the Republicans hated us and the Democrats were happy with us. People blame whatever they can when their preferred candidate loses. That's not a problem with ranked choice voting. That's just a problem with people that don't want to acknowledge that they lost because their candidate wasn't liked, especially if they're a major party candidate. They don't have any excuse. They get on the ballot immediately. They get, if it's a federal race, they get taxpayer funding, and in many states, they get state taxpayer funding too. They have no one to blame but themselves if they lose.
And just finally, and I can understand what you're saying with that, people not understanding our Labor Party had like 32% of the vote in the national federal election this year, and people's like, "Oh, they got in with that." Like, more people preferred them. More people preferred them. That's how it works in Australia. That's how it's worked for about a century now. But fundamentally, do you think there is any way for the major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, to recover support? Because with the way things tracking, it seems like it's only a few years before we have a libertarian in a congressional seat or a Senate race. I think there was
Yeah.
one libertarian senator, although he wasn't elected as such.
Yeah.
So that seems to be the way things are tracking from my perspective here in Australia. What do you think?
They would have to stop representing the ruling class, major multi-billion dollar corporatist interests that bankrolled their way into office and start representing the people again. But if they did that, then that would get rid of their whole reason for setting up the scam that they set up in the first place. So they're not going to do it. I think what they're going to do is continue to milk this cow as long as they can until enough of the public gets fed up with it that they don't care which one of the lesser evils wins, and they give their votes to third party candidates. And until those third party candidates are no longer third parties, they're now the leading parties. I think another thing that's going to happen before that is in many states that already has either a Republican or Democrat party that's very weak compared to the other one, the libertarians or other third parties can come in and become the second party and eliminate the whole lesser evil thing. But no, I think the only way that Republicans and Democrats could, get their support back is to stop being what they are. And it's why they're there. So I don't think that'll happen.
We've cut it fine here with the time on this Zoom meeting, but we've wrapped it up. Spike Cohen, really great speaking to you. And look, if
Thank
you're not
you.
happy with the American media coverage, you've got an independent news outlet here in Australia run by teenagers to look on. So
I love it. I love it.
Thank you very much.
I love it. Thank you for having me on. I'd be happy to come on in the future. Thank you, guys.
Spike Cohen there speaking to myself and Stuart Jeffrey a little earlier. Well, the US midterm elections are next week, of course, and we will have full coverage here on 6 News, on social media, and on our website, 6newsau.com. If you'd like to support our work for just $4 a month, you can head to patreon.com/6newsau. I'm Leonardo Puglisi. Thanks for your company. Good night.